Here's how I turned this 3D model into a ceramic cup. First, I started on the computer with a pyramid and intersected 3 spheres at its peak. The spheres were then subtracted from the pyramid, and this became the base module that was multiplied vertically and mirrored horizontally to establish a 3D flower texture. The texture was then bent 360 degrees and multiplied to establish the desired circumference. Once the design was complete, I beveled the ends and started designing the mold. This included a gallery, an area for the foot plug, 2 female keys, and 2 male keys. This part was then 3D printed in resin, as well as the foot plug. The next step in the process was to create rubber molds of these 3D parts. So here I am creating mold barriers out of wood and pocket screws so that they can be easily assembled and disassembled later on, and you'll see why. After the boxes were fully assembled, the 3D prints were placed into their mold barriers, and I started mixing up a 2-part polyurethane rubber. I really like this material because it can be easily mixed by hand, but it wants to stick to absolutely everything. So after spraying everything down with a mold release, I slowly pour the liquid rubber over the part and cover it by about 2 centimeters. This was then repeated for the foot plug, and the rubber was left to cure for 24 hours. At this point, I could remove those pocket screws and begin to pull the mold barriers away from the rubber. This is why being able to quickly disassemble those boxes comes in handy. And finally, the rubber molds could be pulled up and the 3D parts removed. Ceramic molds have to be made from a specific type of plaster, which starts in liquid form and is poured into the rubber molds. I like to vibrate the molds during this process to break up any air bubbles that might form between the plaster and the rubber. Plaster takes about a half hour to cure, and once removed, I now have a plaster replica of that 3D print. This mold system takes 3 of these parts, which are then secured together with rubber bands to make sure that no leaking occurs when I fill it with a liquid porcelain. The plaster immediately begins to draw moisture out of the clay, and after about 25 minutes, the mold is drained, leaving a shell of clay behind. After the clay has had ample time to stiffen up, that gallery is carefully sliced and lifted away, and finally the mold can be taken apart to reveal that flower texture underneath. But it doesn't end there. The next step is cleaning up the seam lines where the mold parts meet, and then wet lapping the rim of the cup to ensure a perfectly level rim. Now finally we can glaze. Some of these get their color from an airbrush for gradient style effects, and others get fully submerged for a variety of full coverage styles. These are then fired in the kiln to over 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, where the glaze turns into glass, ready to hold your favorite beverage. It's always so hard for me to choose, but let me know in the comments which is your favorite style.